Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 89, Captain White. George White, nicknamed Nobby, was born on the 30th of December 1842 in South Leith, Scotland, the son of Robert White, a merchant, and Agnes Waters. He married Helen Rose Margaret Johnson in Burke, New South Wales, on the 29th of March 1887, when he was 44 and Helen 26. Helen was born in 1861 in New York. She was the daughter of James Johnson, a publisher, and Kate Cow. She departed Plymouth, England on the SS Aberdeen in September 1885 and listed her occupation as a domestic servant. Once arriving in Sydney, she was appointed in the role of governess at a station near Brerawinna. She was an accomplished musician and could speak several languages fluently, and she used to give music lessons. George White became a captain of paddle steamers, particularly in the northern rivers of New South Wales. And he was captain of the Bunyip, one of the paddle steamers that was stranded on the Barwon during the 1886 floods. He also captained a boat called the Brerawinna, and he took the Brerawinna 40 miles up the Moonee in the 1892 floods. The vessel ownership records were often sketchy at that time, but it did show regular transfer of possession of ships and barges between George White and E. Rich and Company during the 1890s. George White, however, retained ownership of Brerawinna throughout the decade, and he also had the boat Excelsior for several years. He also owned Walgett, which was the Brerawinna's barge. Before the railway came to Brerawinna, the town was the terminus for the riverboats from South Australia. The fisheries stopped most of the boats. In flood times, they were able to navigate the bar that was in the river that stopped a lot of them from going up. Only one boat stayed permanently above the bar, and it was called the Wandering Jew, and it ran up to Walgett and higher if the height of the river allowed and the cargo was available. Captain White ran the Wandering Jew on excursions upriver every Wednesday afternoon. The usual trip was made up to the mission station, which was 9 miles upstream, and his wife used to play the piano on the boat and everyone joined in sing-songs. George White and Helen had 5 children. Jessie Ann, born in 1888 in Carlton, Victoria. Helen Isabel, born in Burke, New South Wales in 1889. George Dunlop in Louth, New South Wales in 1891. Agnes Catherine in Burke in 1893. And Morris James in Brerawinna in 1895. George White took the Brerawinna up the Barwon to the Queensland border during the 1893 floods, and in July 1893 it was recorded at Mungindi in Queensland, George White in the PS Brerawinna, having crossed the Queensland border at Mungindi on the Barwon River, became the only captain to take his paddle steamer to the inland waters of 4 Australian colonies: South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. And there was an article in the paper recalling the navigation of the Darling River, the record trip of the steamer Brerawinna to Mungindi. The steamer Brerawinna, with the energy and skill of Captain White, has opened the navigation of the Darling to Mungindi. A few seasons ago, Captain White opened the trade to Moggle Moggle, about 200 miles beyond Walgett. And on the 13th of July, some excitement was caused in Mungindi by his arrival with his steamer laden with supplies which were much wanted. He deserves praise for his pluck in facing a strong current in the river, with the land on both sides being flooded for miles and with no marks to point the channel. His only delay was at Colarendabri, 70 miles below Mungindi, where there is a bridge across the Barwon. The flood was too high to allow the steamer to go under and not high enough to enable it to go around, so a delay of 6 days had to be made. Captain White is of the opinion that if the Barwon was cleared of snags and overhanging timber, it could be navigated in the ordinary seasons by mail steamer such as a Brerawinna from Walgett to Goondiwindi and perhaps to Yatman. And another article, the Warwick Goondiwindi Mungindi Trade. The following is a copy of a letter addressed to the Warwick Municipal Council by the Mr. Surveyor Laverley of Mungindi with reference to opening up a trade in that district. Mungindi, the 26th of July, 1893. To the Mayor of Warwick. Sir, as you might not be aware of our position or existence, I have to inform you that this town is situated on the Barwon River, 2 miles northeast of the end of the boundary line between New South Wales and Queensland, 83 miles from St George, 210 miles from Yulba, 150 miles from Narrabri, 110 miles from Goondiwindi, and 250 miles from Warwick. On the 13th of July, Captain White, with his steamer, the Burrawinner, came here from Bourke with supplies of provisions amounting to about 20 tonne. This circumstance set business persons thinking that it would be much cheaper to get supplies from Warwick if the River Barwon from here to Goondiwindi could be navigated by small steamers. Captain White, when consulted on the matter, gave it as his opinion that if the Barwon River were cleared of snags and overhanging trees and limbs, he would have no difficulty in taking his steamer up the Barwon River to Goondiwindi or even up to the McIntyre Brook at Bengalla. This would bring water carriage to within 100 miles of Warwick at Bengalla or 140 miles at Goondiwindi. Last night there was a public meeting here and it was proposed and carried unanimously that a request to be urged on the government to get the Barwon River between here and Goondiwindi cleared of snags and overhanging trees and limbs in order to get steamers to ply between here and Goondiwindi and get the traffic that now goes to Sydney via Bourke and Narrabri to go to Brisbane via Warwick. It was pointed out by persons who knew the Barwon well that during the last 4 years, with the exception of 3 months, steamers could ply between here and Goondiwindi. And now with steamers on the Barwon, the £2 10 tariff on wool going south, it was also pointed out that it would be open to a market here for the Warwick district and that it would encourage settlement in the land along Barwon River. I've brought this under your notice in order that you might take some steps to get this route opened. The Mayor of Goondiwindi has communicated with. Yours faithfully, Martin Lavelle, Surveyor. The letter was considered and allowed to stand for over a month. The town clerk, in the meantime, made inquiries of the Goondiwindi Council of the feasibility of the scheme. At a meeting of the Goondiwindi Council last week, a similar letter was read, and it was decided that a reply be sent to Mr. Surveyor Lavelle, stating that the council considers the Mungindi people should apply to the New South Wales Government to have the river from Mungindi to Goondiwindi made navigable. The PS Burrawinner was a very busy paddle steamer and she worked mainly on the Upper Darling and Barwon rivers, and during her career she travelled on more rivers and creeks than any other paddle steamer that graced the waters of the Murray-Darling River system. From Echuca to the sea, from Wentworth to Mungindi in Queensland, on the Darling and Barwon rivers, and from Bourke along the Moonee River, the Pagan Creek, the Colgoy River, the Namoy River, and towards the end of her days, the Murrumbidgee River, at least as far upstream as Whitton. There was a recollection in May 1950. It says, another interesting factor concerning the paddle boats in the northwestern district is that the Burrawinner, a small paddle boat, was the only steamer in history of the navigation steamboats in these areas to travel as far as Colonibri. Wharf lumping on the paddle boats deserves a special mention. Men carried flour on their shoulders. Extra heavy material was always moved by steam power. The steam cables or rope, which were driven by engine power of the boat on the axle, was securely attached to a tree in a convenient place after they had been attached to pulley blocks. The cable ravelled around the axle of the paddle wheels when the power was on. The Wandering Jew was captained by George White in 1903, 1908, and also from 1910 to 1914. It was used to transport wool, grains and fruit. It was built by J. Duncan and Partner in Echuca in 1866, and the Wandering Jew was first named the Riverina. After suffering fire damage in 1883, in 1890 the vessel was rebuilt, re-registered and then renamed the Wandering Jew by its new owner, the Jewish migrant Daniel Berger. And Captain George White took the Wandering Jew to Bourke in 1890, and then he purchased the boat himself in 1899. And the tender, the undersigned, having received instructions from Mr. D. Berger of Forbes to offer for sale by tender the well-known trading steamer Wandering Jew, with its 12 horsepower engine, boiler, fittings and gear, including trade fixtures, ready for sea. And that was in October 1899 and was advertised in the Western Herald at Bourke. Archive newspaper advertisements show Mr. Berger as an entrepreneur with business interests in Forbes. He ran the paddle boat between Burke and Wilcannia every fortnight, selling drapery, groceries, boots and clothing. It was not uncommon for hawker boats to travel up the Murray-Darling River system. They had everything that people would require, and they could stop anywhere along the river and exchange goods. Archive records show that in 1903, George White sailed the Wandering Jew to Walgett. In 1912, he made history as the last paddle steamer to ever reach Walgett. In 1927, there was another recollection. Captain George White in the early days pioneered the upper Darling River with a little paddle steamer Brewer and made some precarious voyages along that shallow stream when the water rose sufficiently to ship the big wool cargoes. Even at low water, he managed to make some trips between Burke and Walgett by heaving obstructing snags from his course and skillfully negotiating the rocky shallows known as the fisheries. The fisheries are of national interest as they represent what is probably the only material evidence that the Australian Aborigine had a rudimentary notion of river damming before the white man took over his engineering burdens. The fisheries are a terrace of rocks and stones so set by the natives that they dam the stream, and they also imprison fish in their hollows. As there are 11 feet of fall from the top to the lower end of this artificial terrace, it was naturally a trying task to get even a light little flat-bottomed steamer like the Brewer over the rocky shallows. But Skipper White several times heaved the craft over this obstruction inch by inch with the aid of strong ropes fastened by one end to the trees ahead on the riverbank and with the other end coiled around the shaft of the paddle engine by tugging power. Such heaving was a regular necessity at low water, with a submerged tree at any moment which might hold up even that slow progress. There were at times, however, when a boat could not possibly negotiate the quarter-mile terraces of the fisheries, and in that case the wool cargo was unloaded from a boat above the fisheries and carted down to the other boat waiting at the foot of the rocks. At low water trips, Skipper White achieved some fame. By overcoming obstacles with the aid of his crew of 3 or 4 men, he penetrated outback waterways which other boatmen would not tackle, and in the Great Flood of 1890 actually carried provisions for the Maroon people as far upstream as Mungindi and Colonibri. That was the first time a steamer had ever touched these points, and the venture meant difficult navigation with a careful feeling of the way over flooded bushland and round, partly submerged trees. And in January 1910, Martin and Johnson inform our correspondent that the steamer Wandering Jew, captained by George White in charge, left Brewer at midnight on Saturday with 30 tonne of general goods consigned to the Walgett Township. This vessel should reach there on Tuesday morning. This firm has offered to run a bi-weekly mail service until the railway service has been restored between Narrabri and Walgett. The Wandering Jew held the record from Walgett to Brewer and back, loaded both ways, a trip of 5.5 days. An average load of wool was 27 tonne, occasionally carrying on an extra load of up to 80 tonne. In 1914, it was announced in the paper, the steamer Wandering Jew, the property of Captain George White, was destroyed by fire in the Darling River near Brewer on Tuesday morning. The damage was estimated at £500. The steamer was insured for £300 and the cause of the outbreak is unknown. And there's an amazing photo of the wreckage of the boat, which is just below the weir, very close to the fish traps that were mentioned earlier. And I'll add that to my Facebook page. And the Walgett District Historical Society Museum also has some information on the Wandering Jew. It said paddle steamers played a vital role along the Barwon and Namoi rivers in New South Wales in the 18th and early 19th centuries. One of the more frequent visitors to Walgett was the Wandering Jew, a paddleboat steamer that travelled the rivers for more than 4 decades. The Wandering Jew began its life in Echuca in 1886, registered as a riverina. It was 22 metres long, 4.5 metres wide and had a draft of 1.5 metres. Unusually deep for riverboats, which generally had shallow shafts, sometimes as little as 50 centimetres. It was propelled by side paddles and powered by a 10 horsepower steam engine. The vessel was damaged by fire and subsequently repaired on at least 3 occasions in 1875, 1883 and 1890. By 1890, the owner was George Nobby White, who reduced the boat's tonnage from 76 to 48 tonne. This name, which might today be thought of as offensive, was by the previous owner, the Jewish businessman Daniel Berger, who steamed up and down the river in his boat. Under Captain White, the boat plied its trade between Walgett and Wentworth and at the junction of the Murray and Darling rivers, although in its later years it mainly travelled between Walgett and Brewarrina. Captain White married a woman from a station near Brewarrina. Mostly Mrs. White lived at Brewarrina, but she travelled on the boat with her husband when times were tough. On the boat she liked to have some refinement, and 2 fine coloured glass vases were kept on board as proof of this. The old boat finally tied up in the Barwon above Brewarrina and was used as a floating store until 1914, when fire totally destroyed the vessel. Its skeletal remains rest in the Barwon River mud and have been covered by water since the Brewarrina Weir was constructed. In 2011, there was a $3,200 grant that was received by the Walgett District Historical Society Museum, and they displayed an exhibition that examined the paddle steamer history around Walgett, focusing on the Wandering Jew. The grant enabled investigations into models, and as a result, a fine, detailed model of the Wandering Jew was based on the evidence of early photographs and was made by 2 members of the Dubbo Wool and Wood Turning Group. They also made a model of the Barwon Inn, where many of the steamers moored when they came to Walgett. And there was a letter written by Helen Dash, George White's widow, in the Telegraph Pictorial newspaper, published on the 14th of March 1927, and it's titled Looking Back to Outback. My late husband, Captain George White, was a pioneer skipper of the Upper Darling River and had many trials and adventures with the little steamer Brewarrina during those early days when the river traffic between Burke and Walgett was at its height. Skipper White succeeded in making many low-water trips on the Upper Darling, heaving snags out of the way and overcoming difficulties with his strong little boat and a crew of 3 or 4 men on whom he could rely. Trips with no other skipper with any other boat would undertake. He made a record for himself in the 1890 flood when he carried provisions for the people as far as Mungindi and Collarendabury, feeling the way for the boat round trees and over flooded bushland. This was the first time that a steamer had ever reached upriver, and the trip caused quite a sensation. The Bree, as she was always called, was a small steamer and had been built with an extra strong hull, especially adapted for upper river work. Her usual route was between Burke and Walgett, and the latter town was the recognised terminus for the steamers. The township of Brewarrina is halfway on the journey, and the fisheries there form a natural lock in the river. There's an 11 feet of a fall from the top to the bottom of the fisheries, a distance of about 1/4 mile, and 1 or 2 trips could be made between Brewarrina and Walgett when a boat could get across the rocks, as the fisheries were generally called. The fisheries, which is the only picturesque spot for many miles around, can be walked across with dry feet when the river is low. When a fallen tree or a snag might be met with at any moment, in any bend of the river, obstructing the channel, a dinghy was often sent ahead to survey and, if possible, clear the track. The rise and fall of the river used to be the most interesting piece of news in the district and depended principally upon the rainfall in Queensland. Reports of river height would be published at the post offices from day to day and anxiously watched. A navigable rise during the wool season meant good news for everyone, townsmen, rivermen and squatters. At this time the nearest railway was at Burke, and squatters rejoiced if boats could come and carry their wool away from the stations and get it to Sydney much quicker than if it had to be sent by teams to the railway. The sound of a steamer's whistle was most welcome and caused great excitement. The boat could be heard long before she could be seen coming around the bend. It might be only a short walk across land to the shearing shed, and the steamer would whistle and puff gaily, tugging a barge, sometimes 2 barges, behind her, having miles more to navigate before reaching the shed, where she would discharge her cargo provisions and load wool, or continue upstream to Walgett and pick up the wool on the way down again. Port was generally at Walgett Bridge, but the Bree has often gone up to the Namoy to Walgett Town. It was a sad thing if the river fell during a trip and caused delay. There were hopes that the river might be locked to enable the boats to fight the falls and droughts, but those hopes were never realised. There was a long drought before the 1890 flood, which was the highest flood ever known in Burke. Every street was under water and all business was done by means on dinghy or on horseback. There was only one dry spot in the main street, generally occupied by a big dog belonging to Dr. Coles. The railway station formed a little island on its own and the park was like a small sea. Very different were previous times when Cobb & Co coaches went plodding through the bush from town to town. The boats were all heart-cheering sights as they came down the long reach to Burke. But the branch railway lines to Brewarrina and Walgett were the death stroke to the upriver trade. Skipper White gave up the Bree and took on the Jew, a larger boat for downstream work. In a year or two, the Jew was destroyed by fire. And so goodbye, dear river darling. Perhaps some day the necessary locks may be built and departed glories may return, and boats be seen coming round the circle of your upper bends once more, in the days to come when the way back will not be way back any longer. And she finished off with a small poem, The Golden Land. Sing a song to Australia where nature's caress falls on water and land with desire to bless. Thy glory is sacred to hearts brave and bold. We love thee, Australia, the land of gold. Australia is golden, such is your name, golden Australia of well-earned fame. And in the Goulburn Evening Penny Post, Skipper White, old Darling identity now in Goulburn. Everyone who knows the Darling knows Skipper White. His name is well known from one end to the other, as are the names of his boats, the Maggie and the Wandering Jew. Skipper White is a river master, and he's been navigating the Darling for 40 years or more, first in the Wandering Jew and then in the Maggie. One of the deckhands or stewards or someone employed in the running of the Maggie wandered on board one night when she was moored alongside the wharf at Brewarrina, and possibly not being responsible for his actions, set it alight. Skipper White is now in Goulburn negotiating for the purchase of another vessel, and when this work has been completed, he intends going back to the Darling and continuing his calling. Skipper White is 73 years of age. He's a real old-time captain, very reticent in his speech and having complete disregard for notoriety. Consequently, he refused to give a detailed account of his experiences. He's had an eventful life, dating from early boyhood. The sea has always had a fascination for Skipper White, and before coming to this country, he travelled the world over as a seaman. He was in India as a boy during the closing stages of the mutiny, and had an offer of marriage with a princess on a lonely island, which he had occasion to visit in the course of his trading days. The king of the island sent word to White's vessel that his daughter was ill and asked if something could not be done to save her. The captain went ashore, taking White with him. The girl was restored to health, and so delighted was the king that he gave White the chance of wedding his daughter. The offer was not accepted, and the young seaman afterwards married a New York girl, Mrs. White, a writer and a musician, and while on the Darling composed poetry and wrote numerous letters to the Sydney press, also letters by a dying mother to her children giving them advice on the proper living of their lives. Mrs. White is the author of a libretto based on the story of Solomon's wives and some early seafaring experiences of her husband. Though Mrs. White has submitted a manuscript for criticism, she's been unable to find anyone to take it up, the chief difficulty being the composition of the music, which includes 15 songs. The play is written in the atmosphere of Salt Lake City, and Mrs. White thinks by sending her copy to America, she may meet with better success. If only I could get my husband to talk and tell me all of his experiences, Mrs. White said, I would be able to make a moving picture. He's been everywhere, all over the world, but he won't tell me. The ancient mariner, resting in an armchair before the fire, calmly enjoys his pipe, glancing across at his wife, and he smiles through a cloud of smoke. What would be the good? What interest would it be to the Goulburn people to read about how Skipper White navigates his boat up and down the Darling? Yes, dear, replies his wife, but you could tell of your experiences. And George White died at Brewarrina of cancer on the 12th of February 1917, aged 74, so only 12 months after that article was written. So George White's wife, Helen went on to marry George Dash in Redfern, New South Wales, when she was 57 on the 20th of June 1918. David was 74, and he died only months after their marriage on the 15th of October 1918 in Balmain. He had been married previously to Elizabeth Lloyd in Stawell, Victoria in 1871, and his wife had died in 1898. Helen continued to be a music teacher at her home at Brighton Les Sands in New South Wales well into her 60s. And in 1930, on the 21st of May, there was an article that had the title of Woman Poisoned, Death in Hospital. Mrs. Helen Rose Dash of Brighton Les Sands died at St George's Hospital early this morning as the result of drinking the contents of a cup of poison last night. Her son, Morris James White of Brighton Les Sands, was the informant. Her death certificate states, that the cause of death was poisoning, self-administered while mentally damaged. So such an unfortunate end for Helen, who seemed to be a very creative and talented lady. Captain White and Helen's children. The first child was Jessie Ann, and she was born at the Women's Hospital in Carlton in Victoria on the 8th of January 1888. She married Arthur Roland Deselli, known as Tom, in 1907 in Brewer when she was 19 and Arthur 38. Arthur was born in 1869 in Brighton, Victoria, and he was the son of Francis William Wisdom Deselli and Marie Jane Welsh. Arthur's cousin Constance married Edward Bulwer Lytton, the youngest son of Charles Dickens, who's outlined in my episode 26. Arthur had been a station overseer in Isisford, Queensland in his mid-20s, and was an agent living in Avenel, Victoria in 1903, and after their marriage Arthur ran a station called Talawanta. And in 1912 there was an article referring to Arthur, Snakebite Station Manager. Last night, T.R. Deselli, manager of Talawanta Station at Brewer, on proceeding to obtain a water bag for a drink, was bitten on the right instep by a brown snake about 4 foot long that was lying on a mat underneath the water bag. Mr. Deselli scarified the wound and was driven into Brewer, where he received medical attention, and he is now progressing favourably. So a very lucky escape. Jessie and Tom had 4 children, and in 1921 there was an article where they were seeking a governess. So it says, wanted governess for station north of Broken Hill, which was Quinyamby Station. It was in fact 160 kilometres northwest of Broken Hill. Wanting a governess for 3 children, music essential, apply by letter to Mrs. Deselli at Quinyamby Station via Torrewenge in New South Wales. In 1924, Arthur is recorded as managing Parrakilla Station at Wirramina in South Australia. And it mentions Arthur Deselli in another article titled Water in Far North, Successful Boring Operations, Divining Rod Used. Writing from the far north to an Adelaide friend, Mr. Arthur R. Deselli tells how, with the aid of a divining rod, subartesian water was struck in what was considered a hopelessly dry part of the country. Mr. Deselli, who was at Parrakilla Station at Wirramina on the east-west line, had great faith in the use of the divining rod as a water finder. Confident that he located the right spot, he sank a 5-inch bore to a depth of 140 feet. To the surprise of all the station hands, an abundant supply of pure fresh water was found that rose to a height of 5 feet. Landholders from far and near were jubilant over the find, which has not only provided water for over 600 head of cattle, but has added enormously to the value of the property. Mr. Deselli later put down another bore, getting fresh water at 120 feet. The owner of the property intends to turn it into a sheep run. Mr. Deselli mentions that the want of water has been a tremendous drawback in the far north country for many years, and that the search for it has not been properly gone into before. And that was in December 1925. In 1930, Arthur is listed as a motor driver living at Karoonda in South Australia, and Arthur died at Lower Mitcham, South Australia in November 1940, aged 71. And his death record mentions that he was a dearly loved husband of Jessie and father of Reen, Lyle, Frank and Claudia. In 1963, Jessie was living with her daughters in the Northern Territory. Her daughter Jessie Lyle Deselli was the housekeeper at Seabreeze Hotel at Nightcliff, and her daughter Claudia was the manageress of the Seabreeze Hotel. And Jessie died in Seven Hills, New South Wales in November 1966, aged 78. Captain George White and Helen's second child was Helen Isabel, and she was born in Burke, New South Wales in 1889. Helen married Henry John Gaylard in Queensland on the 30th of August 1915. Henry had been born in the Channel Islands and he'd emigrated to Brisbane from London in October 1909. They had one son, Henry Leslie Gaylard, in Sydney on the 26th of June 1916. However, Helen only died a couple of weeks after the birth of her son on the 4th of July 1916, aged only 27. Their third child, George Dunlop White, was born in Louth, New South Wales on the 25th of July 1891. He was a clerk in Goulburn And in 1912, it mentions Mr. George White, son of Captain White, a pioneer of the Western River steamer traffic, will succeed Mr. R.B. Entwistle at the Goulburn branch of Wright, Heaton and Company. George enlisted in World War I at Goulburn on the 7th of January 1916. He married Edith Frances Brown in Goulburn on the 7th of April 1916 and then sailed from Sydney to England on the 30th of September in that year. He fought in France and he was medically discharged due to paralysis on the left side due to a gunshot wound to the head, which resulted in a fractured skull, and this occurred on the 5th of April 1918. He was discharged on the 30th of August 1918. They had one son, John Dunlop White, born in Newtown, New South Wales, in March 1919. George continued his occupation as a clerk and they lived at Arncliffe in New South Wales, and George died at Arncliffe on the 7th of January 1966, aged 74. Their fourth child, Agnes Catherine White, was born in Burke in 1893. She married Winfred Jocelyn Cox at St Peters, New South Wales in 1923, when she was 30 and Winfred 35. They had a son, Lawrence, at Paddington, New South Wales on the 4th of July 1918. However, Winfred was married to Florence Evelyn in 1913 and was recorded as being still married to her and living in Swan Hill in 1919. Winfred was an engineer, and in 1924 he was listed living alone at Birchip, Victoria. Winfred and Agnes are listed together as living in Forbes, New South Wales in 1930. So I couldn't find any record of Winfred divorcing Florence Evelyn. However, he did marry Agnes in 1923. The fifth child, Morris James White, was born at Brewer on the 1st of July 1895. He married Caroline Shaw at Croydon, New South Wales, on the 24th of March 1917. They had one daughter, Ulla, in 1918 at Narromine. In June 1927, Morris was declared bankrupt and he stated his address as Arncliffe in New South Wales. He worked as an accountant in 1930 at Brighton Les Sands, and in 1934 he was living at Manly. On the 10th of December 1937, Morris was charged with forging and uttering, and he was sentenced to 2 years' jail. An article on the 13th of October 1937 says, remanded on 40 charges. Morris James White, 42, a clerk, appeared at the Central Court today on more than 40 charges of forging endorsements to orders for the payment of money. The police intended to proceed on 14 of the charges, involving amounts totalling to £130. The other charges would be withdrawn as police have no evidence to offer. Morris was remanded until November the 3rd on £100 bail. So another article, nearly £1,800 taken by a clever fraud. By a cunning and clever course of fraud, Morris James White, 42, clerk, had forged and uttered cheques representing a total of nearly £1,800. White was called for sentence following his plea of guilty to 14 charges of forgery and 14 of uttering. Judge White sentenced the prisoner to 2 years' imprisonment, less 1 week. Without making any definite promise, the judge said that he would consider the question of a remission of portion of the sentence if restitution was made. The prisoner, according to the detective, attributed his lapse to meeting commitments to SP bookmakers over betting losses on horses and dogs. Detective Brown stated that White had been employed in a position of trust for the past 9 years by J.J. Sullivan Limited Merchants of Sussex Street City. Some years ago, a shortage was discovered in his accounts, but the firm gave him a chance to redeem himself on making good of the shortage. About 18 months ago, by a cunning and cleverly arranged system of manipulating book entries, White obtained 46 cheques valued at £398, on which he forged endorsement, and these together with 63 additional cheques for £1,400 he cashed. The people who cashed the cheques included a woman in a small suburban business, and this refunded to J.J. Sullivan Limited £1,225. They were now out of pocket to that amount, while Sullivan's losses were nearly £600. After Mr. W. Lieberman, for the prisoner, had produced evidence of previous good character, Judge White said that he could not grant a bond. And another article, 2 years jail for forgery. J.A. Jackson, an advertising contractor, said he was prepared to employ White on road sign erection work after Christmas. His counsel said that White's relatives were prepared to make restitution of £120. White would undertake to pay off a certain amount each week if bound over. Judge White said that reimbursement would be considered when application for the reduction of sentence was made. And while this was going on, Caroline did remain married to Morris. In 1949, he's listed as living at Roseville, working as a wholesaler, and in 1963 is living at Balgowlah, New South Wales, and working again as a clerk. Morris died in Manly in May 1966, aged 70. So it seems that Captain White was a very successful paddle steamer captain, particularly up in the northern rivers of New South Wales.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.